Oh, there it is. Oh, yeah.
There we go. All right. Well, tonight is the first of a number of different meetings. We are going to take this process and spread it out over the course of a year. So instead of every week, meeting on every Thursday, we're going to give ourselves time to really digest and have the opportunity to explore and hopefully to get it into our calendars so that the majority of people can be here for each of those times. So I would like for us to begin with prayer. Would you bow with me? God of all times and places, come to us this evening as we gather to begin a journey of awakening to justice in our lives. We thank you for this opportunity to gather and learn, for the chance to explore difficult issues, to speak honestly from our hearts, to acknowledge our own parts in the systemic racism in our world. Open our eyes. Help us to feel deep connection with others on this journey. Lead us, challenge us, help us to grow. Light a fire in our hearts, a passion for justice, that we might be faithful members of your beloved community. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, I'm going to put this on speaker view so that whoever is speaking should show up on the monitor, although that's not happening on my thing right now. What I'd like to do is to be able to record it so that our presenters are the people who are on. So if you are currently not muted, could you please mute yourself? Except for AG and Doug.
Yeah, hi, Wendy.
How do I do
Don,
that?
Don, you could pinpoint both Doug and I. That would bring us,
I can do
that
both of
would,
those. Thank you.
yeah,
Clearly,
that would
I'm
put
sort
us,
of new to this
Okay,
that's
how
quite
does
all right.
Zoom
this
thing.
one, how do you mute yourself?
Um, in the bottom left-hand corner for me, there's audio. Why am
Oh,
I,
I see it.
do you see where
You're
to
in
pin?
speaker view, so you have to
I have to get out of speaker view, sorry.
go to gallery.
Gallery, and then pin
I don't know. You pin
AG,
as a.
and I have to find Doug. Sorry. Okay.
If,
You get there. Yeah.
Add pin. Oh, look at that. There you are. Brenda would want to be one of the people that I pinned, or just the two of you?
Just the
It,
two of
Okay.
Doug, you seem to be muted. Maybe that's deliberate. I don't know.
oh,
Yeah, I'm not talking yet.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. Well, welcome, Doug and AG. We're so thankful to have you here, and we look forward to hearing a little bit about what the process of being a part of this faith project has been for you. And I expect that you work with groups of people all the time. So tell us a little bit about yourselves and the connection to this project.
HA, you're the one with a direct connection to the congregation, so you should start.
sure. Thank you for inviting us, Doug and I, to this gathering. You all are really pioneering for us. And I thank you for being our guinea pigs, as you're one of the early congregations that are taking this book seriously and taking a look at it. And so we will we will follow you with great curiosity to hear how you're doing, and looking forward to hearing from Dawn and from Connie and Jim how it's going. And my name is A.G. Miller. That stands for Albert and George Miller. Um, I teach I'm a retired professor from Oberlin College, where I taught American and African American religious history. I retired from the college in 2018. I also serve as a pastor of the Oberlin House of the Lord Fellowship. It's a small Pentecostal congregation that I'm a part of a denomination called the House of the Lord Churches. And we started that church in the basement of our home some 22 years ago, or 23 years ago. We were a house church for 18 years. We have now purchased a former church and renovated it, and we've been in that building for 5 years now. So my coming into, well, I'm also the cousin of Connie and Jim through marriage. Connie's mother and Brenda's father were brother and sister. And as God would have it, that we searched them out. They had a long history of not knowing each other, and through ancestry work, we found Connie and Jim, and it has been, well, I don't know how many years now, 10, 12 years. And it was immediate attachment to on both sides of this family. And so they, from my perspective, they become sisters to each other in this process. And so it's been great to get to know Jim and Connie and to come up to Canandaigua periodically. We always tend to come in the winter, which is strange, but when it's snow on the ground. But we love coming up there and spending time with Jim and Connie. So, and we've heard so much about this congregation. So wonderful thing. So I came into this from a phone call from one of the collaborators who asked me if I would be willing to be the host for the developing group called the Dialogue on Race and Faith, as they were doing research on two people who graduated or came through the Oberlin College in the 1830s. And one other person, Nancy Prince, who was an African-American woman who was born and raised in the Boston community in the 1800s, but whose family goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. And because of the connection that Oberlin had with the abolitionist movement, it was kind of quasi-founded on these abolitionist principles. When I say quasi, it had a rebirth in 1835. Its initial founding is 1833. But as I'll let Doug give a bit more of that history in his introduction. But I was asked to come and to be a part of the planning of a group of scholars that were coming together and to organize their trip to Oberlin, and then to organize a visit down to Cincinnati to the Freedom Museum. And I don't know if anybody has been to Cincinnati, Ohio, but it's well worth the travel along the Ohio River. The Freedom Museum is dedicated to the abolitionist movement and freedom struggle of many African Americans and who were coming across the Ohio River, and many of the abolitionists, white and black, who supported them in their trek to freedom north through Kentucky into Ohio, and some cases all the way into Canada. And so we set up a visit and tour there, and along with Lane Theological Seminary, which was a Presbyterian school that was founded in 1829 or thereabouts, that was organized as a school to educate young evangelists and ministers who were going to go out into the Midwest, what we now call the old Northwest, into the West as the country was developing. And that group of young a group of those young students came as radical abolitionists. And through a series of debates that those students did on the campus to convert both Northerners and Southerners to the abolitionist cause, they were pretty much summarily ostracized, and then they chose to leave the school because they would not stop their abolitionist work. And they were invited to Oberlin in 1835, and that is the beginning of the Oberlin School of Theology that came along with the Oberlin College, that set the stage for our book. And as I began to get involved in this process, I said, wow, this is a great project. And then Doug and I had a conversation, and he invited me to be a part of the group, and you have read the one chapter that I contributed, which focuses on black and white life in Oberlin. But I'll stop there. That gives you at least a sense of my own kind of coming into this place. But Doug has been our leader in our group of. Our group is really more than just the 8 or 9 writers who write in the book. There are several other people who are in this group that participate with us, and you see some of that on the website and in the film. But it is a group of about 14 folk who have come together. And actually that's expanded over time as well. So come together to create the dialogue on race and faith. Doug, why don't you pick it up from
Excuse me
there?
for just a second, AG, it's Dawn. I just wanted to clarify for the people that are out there going, "Ooh, I didn't read the chapter that AG did."
Don't
We
worry
haven't
about it.
started reading yet.
Okay,
We
okay,
watched the
good,
film and we're getting ready to start.
good, okay, good. Sorry about
That's
that.
where we're at. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for the clarification.
Well, hi everyone. It's really great to see you and to know that you're about to embark on this project, also your own church's project, and that's a wonderful thing that you're being led on. And I hope that it's a way for you to learn more and to be more discipled, if you will, in what the gospel entails for us, which is what we believe in our project. Let me tell you, I'd like to give you a little. Oh, and I'm Doug Strong. I teach at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle, and I've been here. This is my 18th year teaching here. Before teaching here, I taught at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. I was there a long time as well. And before that, I was in Princeton studying, which is where AG and I actually first met. I was at the seminary there. And then, I'm also a United Methodist minister, ordained clergy in the United Methodist Church and pastored a church in New Jersey. But what most connects me to you all, I think, is that I grew up in Springville, New York, which is about 30 miles south of Buffalo. My family has been in Western New York State since 1830. And they moved westward from Vermont, as is a common story for people that have been in Western New York or Central New York State for a long time, as they moved westward and settled there in actually what's the town of Farmersville, New York, which describes exactly what they were doing. And that's where my family was. And then we moved to the big town of Springville, which had 4,000 people. And that's where I grew up. And it was so I'm a product of upstate New York. And as a kid, I was very interested in history, local history. My grandfather used to tell lots of stories about the old time in the 19th century, and it fascinated me. And I was particularly interested in the fact that our own area was an area of the Underground Railroad. And I know that's true, of course, in central New York as well. And of course, these were people often headed toward Canada and to the places where they could cross. So, in my case, in the town I lived in, they were on their way to Buffalo to cross over the Niagara River. Sometimes in your area, they were ready to going to ports on Lake Ontario to cross over, or to go up further beyond Watertown and up further north to cross over there. But not all of them crossed over into Canada. Many stayed in upstate New York, right? And so the largest Underground Railroad depot, we call that, it's really the place where folks helped people, was in Syracuse, the largest one in New York State, and it was run by a very important person, African American preacher and pastor and his wife. And they ran it there in Syracuse in conjunction with white folk as well. And there were many, many people. You may have heard of Garrett Smith, who was in Peterborough or Smithfield, which is southeast in Madison County. And then, of course, you know about Seneca Falls and Canandaigua itself. So there were just many places where the Underground Railroad was very active. And this fascinated me as a kid. And as a young man who was a Christian, very involved in my United Methodist Church in Springville. But I was struck by the fact that not everybody supported this abolitionism, and it raised the question for me about why, to me, even as a 13, 14, 15-year-old reading the Bible, it seemed pretty obvious what Jesus would have us do to help people who were running for their lives. And why didn't everybody support that? Well, one wonderful thing is in my research, even eventually as a teenager and then a little later, is to find out that my own family's church, which was a Free Will Baptist church, that denomination, the Free Will Baptists, were heavily involved in the Underground Railroad, and the entire denomination. It's different from the regular Baptists. The Free Will Baptist was a smaller denomination, and they were all abolitionists. And that was kind of a wonderful for me to hear. Anyway, all this prompted me to study revivalism and social reform in upstate New York, and that's what I did my dissertation on, and actually wrote books about that before. So if you're really nerdy and want to read more, my dissertation was published by Syracuse University Press and is about upstate New York, and actually talks about all the churches that were abolitionist churches. There were, in the 1840s, there were about 250 churches throughout upstate New York that were abolitionist churches, and how that connected with actually even the political life of that era. Anyway, that's beside the point right now. But that expresses my interest in this area. And so the story goes, which you'll read about in the book, is that in 2015, a friend of mine who I had known at Princeton Seminary, we were classmates together, he was chaplain at Adrian College in Michigan. It's a small Methodist school you may have heard of. Well, Adrian College was an offshoot of Oberlin. So AG's talked about Oberlin. Oberlin was a real hotbed of evangelical social reform. Now, you may say, wow, how do those things go together? But that was the reality of the 1830s and 40s, right? A revivalist social justice effort. And this was centered in Oberlin, but there were at least 8 to 10 other colleges that were spawned as modeled after Oberlin, including, for example, Berea College in Kentucky, Tabor College in Indiana. There was a small one in Cortland, New York, which doesn't exist anymore, called Central New York College. And then Oneida Institute in Utica. And all of these were similar abolitionist schools, but one of them was Adrian. Okay, why is this important? Because the first president of Oberlin was a guy by the name of Asa Mahan. He was very good friends with Charles Finney, who was the great, they often call him the Billy Graham of the 19th century. He was the most famous evangelist of the 19th century. And Charles Finney and his friend Asa Mahan were co-leading this effort at Oberlin. And Asa Mahan later left Oberlin. He was the first president of Oberlin, and he left to become the first president of Adrian College. And so this is important for this reason. My friend Chris was the chaplain at Adrian, and they were remodeling a building at Adrian College and tearing out all the partitions. And there was a closet, and back in the back of the closet, there was a box, and they were ripping out the closet, and they found this box, and they said, well, what's in here? Well, there was all sorts of paraphernalia. There was, photos from the 1950s and a beanie and a, banner and a lot of old newspaper articles. But at the bottom of the box was a notebook, an old notebook with yellowed pages and handwriting. And the pages on the handwriting were dated 1839, 1840, 1841. And so they took this box to the library. The librarian didn't quite know what to do with it, and she called Chris, who had seminary training, and said, can you look at this and see what you think it is? Chris was a very good researcher, is a very good researcher, and he took that notebook and spent lots of time reading it and determining by what was said in the notebook, in the diary, that it was the diary of David Ingram. Now, David Ingram was a close friend of Charles Finney and Asa Mahan. But Ingram died of tuberculosis. And we think that what must have happened is that somebody gave the diary to Asa Mahan and he took it with him to Adrian. And that's how it got there. But here's what I want you to see. This diary had not been seen since 1841 and was stuck in a closet at Adrian College for, many, many, many decades. And so to think that here's this document that is not just a diary, but it's an account of many, many things that, including the spiritual life of this man. He thought of it. We don't think David Ingram ever thought that this diary anyone would read it other than himself. And so it's clearly his own musings, his reflections, his devotional life, and his comments about he was a missionary to recently emancipated enslaved people from Jamaica. And he talks about his relations with those folk and starting schools for them. And what does it mean to have a school and to start churches for them? And then what does it mean to have fellowship? And then, of course, he also invites this woman that A.G. Miller mentioned, Nancy Prince, who's an African-American educator from Boston, and he invites her to come to Jamaica to be a teacher there in Jamaica as well. So there are all these interactions that are taking place, and the diary is such a rich primary source. So Chris talks to me, and he says, what do you think we should do with this? Well, historians, what we tend to think is, well, we'll transcribe it and give it to other historians. But it was, by the time Chris and I were talking about it, it was 2020. And if you remember all the events of 2020, it was a time of George Floyd and, of course, everything that had preceded that. And it just seemed to us that the struggles of the abolitionists are really not that different from the struggles that we have today. And that the call that was on the life of David Ingram is a call that's on all of us, a call to be faithful to the gospel on issues of race in our country. And so that was what compelled some of us to then go to a funding agency and ask if we could have a grant so that we could meet together to go to Oberlin, where AG and Brenda hosted us. And then to do some other events, and then to write the book and make the film that you've seen. So that's the story. One more connection, though, before I stop talking. So David Ingram, who was this Oberlin student, actually first at Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, that AG mentions, and then goes to Oberlin. But where did he come from before going to Cincinnati? Lima, New York. That's where he grew up. And so there's another connection right up the road from you folks, right? So that's where, and he heard Charles Finney preach at in Lima, New York, at his church, and that's how he got involved going to Lane Seminary and then eventually to Oberlin. So there are all these connections that are local to you all, and I think that's pretty exciting. And I hope it'll get you excited about what does it mean to even look at the research about what happened in Canandaigua and surrounding towns and how that impacted on the Underground Railroad and other abolitionist activities. Okay, enough for that.
One thing that might be important to mention is that David Ingram also documented and perhaps Doug, you can speak to this. He documented the arrival of a slave ship. Can you take it from there, please?
Sure. I should have talked about that. I got too excited about the local connections for you all. Yeah, so here's David Ingram. He's 27 years old, recently married, has a little baby, living in Jamaica, trying to do his best to see what the gospel implications are for his life and the lives of those that are around him, and realizing that the Afro-Caribbeans in Jamaica had only very recently been emancipated. And actually, there was an emancipation, but just like in the US, even though we emancipated slaves by the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, nonetheless, all sorts of discrimination continued. The same thing happened in Jamaica, and maybe even worse at the beginning. And so what David Ingram had to contend with, he's a white man trying to work with Afro-Caribbeans in Jamaica, but getting opposition from other white folk who don't like what he's doing. Meanwhile, it's clear that he's an advocate for the black folk in Jamaica. And so the British Navy at this time was interdicting illegal slave ships that were coming from the west coast of Africa. Britain, by this point, had actually finally risen to the challenge and realized that slavery was evil and were doing something about it. But there were all these other ships that were sailing, even though the slave trade was illegal, they were still bringing enslaved people from West Africa. And interestingly, what were the two countries' flags that were raised by these slave ships? Well, Portugal and the USA were the two. Why? Because those countries did not enforce the treaties against slave trade. So there was a Portuguese flagged ship that had enslaved people, and the British Navy was able to capture it and bring it to Kingston, Jamaica, and released the 556 people who were on board that ship. Now, this ship was 800 square feet, and there were 556 enslaved people on board. In fact, there's an account that they were initially going to have less number of people, but the captain of the ship decided not to have his own captain's quarters so that they could tear down that small section and put more slaves in it. So it was obviously a ship of horrors. And after they released all the folk in Kingston, they asked David Ingram, the British Navy asked David Ingram to come on board and document what he saw. which that is interesting in itself, right? Why did they ask David Ingram? Well, they obviously trusted him. And so he went on and he did, and I'm going to read to you. So by the way, in the book, at the back are excerpts from David Ingram's journal. And I'm going to read to you from what happens. This is what he said, and part of this was you might have heard in the movie. Okay, December 25th, 1839. So it's interesting. It's Christmas Day. At Port Royal for health. Well, Port Royal was the port city next to Kingston. And so he was there. David Ingram was always unhealthy. And so he went to try to be healthier. As the slave brig Ulysses has been lately taken by the English schooner of war Skipjack, so that's the name of the British boat, and brought to this port, I've taken a part of the day to examine the brig and measure the apartments where the slaves were stored. And when told that 556 slaves occupied but about 800 square feet, and that their rooms were but 2 feet 5 inches in the clear, so that means the distance of the height of the rooms was 2 feet 5 inches, it seemed almost impossible. Oh, where are the sympathies of Christians for the slave? And where are their exertions for their liberation? Oh, it seems as if the church were asleep, and Satan has the world following him. We named our book Awakening to Justice after that line. Oh, it seems as if the church were asleep. This is Ingram continuing, I took the rise, slope, and the measurement of the 4 apartments where the slaves were confined, and the following is a view of the same with the number and class confined in each room. So he then creates a diagram in his journal of the actual slave brig. And then he notes how many enslaved people were stuffed into each of these very small compartments. And then he writes, as I contemplate the awful suffering that these poor people must have endured during a passage of 50 days from the coast of Africa, my soul is in disbelief, and I feel to exclaim, how long, O Lord, shall these poor creatures be torn from their homes and made to endure so much for the avarice of men? Oh, who can measure the guilt or sound the iniquity of this nefarious traffic and its twin sister slavery? Oh, that I may pray more often and with more faith for the oppressed. I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments just as you heard that reading.
Feel free to
Between
unmute
the
yourself and just speak. You don't need to be.
Deb, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, my mom and I were just kind of groaning about the whole where are the Christians? Where are the, how come no one's doing anything about this? How can this be happening when so-called Christians are involved? Just
Yeah,
that.
and that was David Ingram's question, wasn't it? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
David, the excerpt you just wrote reminds me, I guess, of the theological hymnal lament. It's really a lament of the suffering. And I've watched the film several times, and there are one or two major takeaways. I don't know where you want to go with these ideas, how much you want to get into analysis at this point or not. But it's always seemed to me that this is a moral theological issue that cries out for solution, but the pathways of solution are political and legal and legislative. And the rub is that theoretically you can't legislate morality. So you're kept in this tail chasing circle of individual conversions and good people trying to do good things on a micro level. But how do you change the systems and structures that will result in more equality and justice? And that to me is, I mean, if you look at our political world today and what's going on with the dismantling of DEI and the universities and whatever, we're up against extraordinary forces, which is not to say we should in any way give up or not do anything. But I just wonder about the juxtaposition of those two forces.
Jim, I'm struck by your comment, you can't legislate morality, which of course we've heard many, many times. But if we think objectively, every single piece of legislation is is about morality. Everything, every kind of legislation, even the most mundane budget legislation is moral because it has to do with the decisions we're making about people's lives. And so I've always disagreed with the fact that you can't legislate morality. I think we legislate it all the time. We just don't admit it.
Yeah, there are moral implications to every piece of legislation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One thing that struck me about the film, first there were just one point after another that I just had to nod my head and agree with. But at one point, the rationale for doing what people were doing and also for what the church, the position that the church took was greed. It was about money. And we have to kind of finally accept the fact that there were people such as David Ingram and Nancy Prince and so many others who knew this was not the behavior of a Christian people. This was not the behavior of people who believed in God, but greed. And if you want to, at least I've been looking at it from that point of view, greed and the opportunity to make money was so present that people were looking away from what was right and doing what would make them wealthy.
We have to remember that not only I think it's often the case that Northerners, and I'm speaking to Northerners, we often feel kind of like, well, we weren't the ones we weren't the slave states. But you know, the entire North was profiting off the economy that was in the South, right? And so that's why the vast majority of Northerners did not speak up against slavery.
And I would also add, Doug, that slavery was in the North. It disappeared by legislation. But if we look at people like Sojourner Truth, trying to remember, Ulster, New York, her first language was Dutch. And she was enslaved in Ulster County, New York. If you go to New York City, I would encourage you, if anybody travels to New York for plays or movies or etc. The next time you go to the African Burial Ground Museum. They're just north of City Hall, Chambers, 2 blocks north of Chambers Street. 1990 or 91, 2 blocks north of City Hall. This is all part of Federal Plaza. And they were excavating the ground to build a new federal building. And they began to dig up bones. And they realized that they had struck a graveyard. And after being, in some ways, forced to stop excavation, to go back to the city maps, to the early 17th century, and they found out that that area was a burial ground. And in fact, all of the federal buildings and Federal Plaza and the FBI and the IRS and everything that's in that area was built on that burial ground. They were able to dig up over 600 bodies in that space. And by the maps, they were able to figure out, and they took them to Washington, D.C., to Howard University, to the anthropology department, and they began to do studies on those bones, and they began to learn. And in fact, much of what we now know about DNA and tracing DNA back is learned from that research. And they were able to then bring those bones back and then reintern them and to create a memorial to them that is a part of the National Park Service. And they figured out that over 20,000 Africans were buried in the African burial ground underneath what we now know as the federal courts, the FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, and all of that area just north of City Hall. New York City was a major slave port. And so this is not just a southern experience or a southern issue, but it's an American issue that I think that we all have to really take notice of and be mindful of. I'd love to hear from some of the others' thoughts, comments. Patty, Linda, you need to unmute. I think you're talking.
Okay. I think it's always about greed and power. And it seems to be a basic instinct of people to want more and want power. But it seems to me, at least I think by starting with churches, I think this is a good idea. And if church after church would join with this idea of justice, maybe, it would spread. And if you have to start somewhere, the idea that we don't want our country to be based totally on greed and power. And I think right now, the way things are, the country is run by billionaires, and it's all about greed and power. So it's a scary thought for me. I certainly have no solutions, but I do think that at least Christians should be able to grasp this if they believe in the Bible and believe in what Jesus said. I know our church, I think everybody does, but I don't know.
Thank you.
This is Nancy. I would just say that you don't need to go far to find evidence. The small museum across the street from the church in Canandaigua has their first census is 1790, and you can go through those records. And this would be when Canandaigua, the community, was about 10 years old. A lot of the big names, the street names in Canandaigua, those families, if you look through those records, you can find out the names in some places and or the sex and age of people who in our own community were slaves in some of those big houses that line our main street and Wall Street. It's arresting and disturbing, and it's very close at hand.
This is Jackie. To Linda's point about starting with the churches, what about all the churches in our nation, though, that seem to support the people who want the billionaires in power? That's what I don't understand.
Well, I would say that it all has to do with what your theology is. What are the beliefs that you hold, and how do they represent your life, and how do they manifest themselves in your life and your behavior? Theology really makes a difference, and that's what uh, I hope that as you read the book and read about these three people that we've highlighted, they had a very specific theology. That is, they believed that the primary attribute of God is love, and that attribute it has been given as a gift to us as humanity from God through Christ, and that we have an obligation then to live that out in what they called a sanctified life. And all these have implications. Now, there were other people at their time that didn't hold to those beliefs and didn't act the way they did. And there are people today that consider themselves Christians but have very different theologies. Our theology makes a difference. What we believe makes a difference. For example, let me give you one other. These people thoroughly believed in evangelism, sharing the gospel, but they did so in a way that was inclusive, right? That everyone should be given the opportunity to hear the gospel. And so that would be whatever race. So they did. So the Oberlin folks, for example, and it's not only Oberlin, by the way, it's also all these churches that were, and I said there were about 250 of them just in New York, upstate New York. So we're talking about a lot of different communities. And what they were preaching was, yes, sharing the gospel, but open to people of color, especially African Americans and Native Americans. And this is interesting, they really took seriously the idea that human sin is a real thing. And I think that's important for us. We tend to sort of minimize that today because it's uncomfortable. But I think what you're describing with greed is a consequence of the sin in our lives. And what they wanted to do was to ask, and these like Charles Finney and Asa Mahan, the people I'm talking about, they talked about repentance. So we actually have to give it up to God and ask God to transform us, and that God will transform us once we give it over. Well, that takes some humility on our part. It takes us being willing to admit that we're not perfect, but God wants us to move towards that, but we're not there yet. And so these are all theological beliefs that I'm describing. And so what we believe matters.
I don't disagree with that. But you have churches out there that say one thing but seem to do something different.
Actually, I think they do exactly what they say. I think the churches that you're talking about actually are acting on the beliefs that they have. I don't think they're, people say those like, and I won't mention political figures, but folks that support a certain, a president-elect, whoever that might be, that those Christians that are supporting that are being hypocritical. I don't think they're being hypocritical at all. I think they're very consistent with their beliefs. I disagree with what I disagree with is their interpretation of the
Exactly.
scripture and how they see who Jesus was and what he asks of
Yeah.
us.
Well, if you ask them, though, they would say that they are very religious.
Yeah.
I know people that are saying that.
Oh, of course
That
they
Yeah,
do.
of course.
yes, they say
Yeah.
that they are very religious and
Oh, I
very
agree.
holy, and they pray and they go to church, and
And I
you
don't
know,
disagree with any of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is,
but yet
what do they?
they're out there saying things against um, anyone that's different than them. Let's put it
Sure.
that way.
Yeah.
Right. So what I would do is not ask them, do you pray? Do you do all those things? What do you actually believe? Do you believe that God's grace is given unequivocally and without question to every human being? There. And will they say that? I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's exactly the era, in that era of Jesus, that he has to challenge those folk who see themselves as very religious. And they go through all of the right steps of the time frame they pray in certain ways, they fast in certain ways, yet they treat the poor with contempt. They they look down upon certain people and want to stone the woman caught in adultery, as opposed to have compassion for her. And I think that you know, how many? I don't know if you all are congregations, so do y'all read the King James Bible? I'm joking, but I grew up in the Pentecostal tradition, and we read the King James Bible. That was the only version that you read, and in many cases, all of the words of Jesus were in what? Red letters.
Right.
And I think we need to go back to reading the red letters of Jesus.
Yes.
And ask Jacqueline to judge these folk not based on what they say, but how they respond to the red letters of Jesus. Let Jesus be the marker by which you judge yourself and them. And what does Jesus say in Matthew, in all of the Beatitudes? What does that mean for us in the 21st century? And I think that that's a part of this theology that Doug is talking about, that we have are we developing a theology that comes out of Jesus, or out of our own greed, or out of someplace else that justifies our own theology? Even in the 19th century, there were many, many Christians who disagreed and were active supporters of slavery based on the theology that they interpreted from those texts. In some cases, they may use this very same text that the abolitionists would use to condemn slavery and to call for equality. They might try to use those very same scriptures in order to justify the enslavement of other human beings.
Do you have an example of that?
I guess that's what I have a hard time with.
Look, this is the Doug and I, we grapple with this as historians, right? And as we're looking at thinking about those folk who supported, and it's not only Southerners who are supporting slavery, it's Northerners who are also supporting slavery and interpreting these texts in a certain way. And so, they'll look at the stories of Moses and Abraham, and they'll say, well, Abraham had slaves, so slavery must be okay.
Right.
And
Right.
in
And
reality,
Jesus never, and they'll say, Jesus never condemned slavery. Right. They'll use that kind of language, but they won't interrogate the language of that just talk about the Beatitudes, to talk about how do we understand our relationship to God, and how do we treat others as we would do ourselves. And I think that that's where we have to kind of get on in the ground of having discussions and with others who claim to be a part of your same faith, yet come to very different conclusions, not just about slavery, but about how you treat the immigrant, for instance.
Right.
Jesus was a refugee, but and I wonder how he would have fared in this country, given the ways in which some of the policies are being proposed, even in a Democratic administration. So it's not just a Republican thing, but it's also a Democratic issue, right? It's about how do we treat people and how do we welcome them. I think one of the things that I've appreciated about this project is that you probably know of all the big name abolitionists. Of course, Frederick Douglass is big in your region, right? And Harriet Tubman, and then and Doug mentioned some of the great, many of the great, Garrett Smith and others. Yeah, exactly. Who were advocates and abolitionists, full blown white people who are abolitionists, and those are the ones that we always hear about. But what's so exciting for me about this project is that we have these relatively unknown individuals who, in their own way and in their own lives, are trying to not just speak out about, but to live out their call and their commitment and their love for God and their love for humanity, that they're willing to go against the odds and go against the grain, to not just minister to those enslaved Africans, but to treat them as fellow human beings and fellow Christians, and treat them in a way that shows their intrinsic worth and value. And I think that that's a part of why that these exemplars are so important for us to study, because they may get closer to being who you are than all of the big name folk that we're talking about. These were ordinary people with no resources and very little money, but who were willing to put themselves on the line in order to do what God had called them to do.
I'd just like to say thank you so much. This is I have so much going on in my head, and I'm sure everybody does. And I won't do justice to everything I'd like to say. But I can't tell you how hopeful this is. We've just been through Advent. The darkness has been, for me, it's been too long, too dark. And it's almost a full circle moment for me, because growing up the way I did, very spiritual,
I didn't see my church ever be a part of justice.
Yeah.
I mean, even as a young woman, young child, I saw things that just I thought, well, the church isn't going to do it. So it's just not going to do it. And yet throughout my life, I did have individuals, like individual preachers, individual nuns who said to me, no, you just follow the gospel, follow Jesus's words, believe and hope and don't give up. And then going through my life, being a part of justice for in employment, justice for people with disabilities. It's been a struggle, and I keep thinking we're making progress. And then some things occur, even recently, things that are said that I just can't believe. And I feel like we're way back to the beginning again. So this is full circle, because now I feel like our only hope is to go back to the Christians that have the theology that lines up with justice for people. And that was a long-winded, who knows what I just said, but thank you. I really appreciate this.
Molly, that was great. I encourage all of you, if you're picking up the book, I don't know how many are actually going to have the physical copy, but I mean, even if you don't, you can look on our website, which is awakeningtojustice.com. And on the website are these documents that are the primary documents. So Ingram's journal, the autobiography of James Bradley, who's the African American classmate of Ingram, and then the narrative of Nancy Prince, which is her autobiography. So these three documents they're in the book, and they're also on the website. Yeah, thank you, AG. There's the website you can go to. And my point is, I encourage you to read them, because even though, of course, they're 180 years old, and they talk sometimes, they write, I guess I would say, a little bit differently than we might. But still, what you'll see coming through is the fervency of their faith, their clarity in knowing that God is with them, and their theology. And it's going to come through very, very, very evidently. So I think you'll enjoy reading those things.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on that, what Doug has just said. As Doug and I are historians, and so we will read what another scholar may write, but then I want to go back and read the original documents in order to see if he or she interpreted it correctly. And so I want to encourage you to do the same with us. Go back to the original documents that are there of Bradley and Ingram and Prince, and to read them for yourself, and to see if we as scholars are interpreting them correctly. And to, again, as Doug suggests, I think that you will gain a lot from that in terms of digesting their own words and their particular positions as they're living out their faith. The study guide, I think, is another great source that's on the website. You can download it. Everything on the website is open source, and so you can download everything. The study guide. There is a wonderful chorale, a requiem to the Middle Passage that one of our collaborators, who is a part of the dialogue on race and faith, who is a composer. And when he saw that diagram of the ship, he said, "I heard music."
Oh.
And then he writes roughly a 15-minute requiem to the Middle Passage, and it is just powerful. That score is also on the website and is downloadable, and we encourage people to replicate it. Use it as a part of your worship experience or programmatic experiences. And so we're trying to, in as many ways as possible, to get to various mediums, whether it's the film, the music. Every author has a small clip describing the book, their chapter, as an intro to that chapter. And so you can also you can also listen to those each of us as we are talking about the chapters that we're writing. So we're trying to make it as accessible as possible for people to be able to get information and to find their way into the study of the book itself.
Thank you, AG. Another thing I would mention about the discussion guide, which is AG's mentioned is downloadable, is that each week or whenever you decide you're going to study a chapter, each chapter's and the questions related to on the discussion guide, there's also a prayer that comes from one of our three people that is either from Ingram or Prince or Bradley. There is that so that you can pray together. There's a hymn or song that comes from the era that's in for each week. I encourage you to either sing that together, or if you're not into singing as a group, you can even just read it together, like in unison. So all there are these in along with the questions that you can answer.
Yeah. And the book is also on Audible, and it's also on Kindle.
Thank you for letting us know about all of the things that are on the website. I think everybody will have books, but I didn't know about like the music and the clips. That's really great. And the leaders of this group are going to use the study guide. We've already downloaded
Great.
it. There's so much stuff in the study guide that
Yeah.
you can't do it in, you can't answer all of those questions. So it's
That's
wonderful
right.
to have all of that information so we can pick and choose what to talk about.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much. One of the questions that I sent you earlier that I would love for us to sort of conclude with is how the process of being a part of the Faith Project has transformed your spirituality and your understanding of God, and what this process has done for you as faithful people.
Let me start by saying we as a group of scholars had to walk ourselves through a process. Some of us knew others of us, but not everybody knew everyone. And when you're dealing with such an intensive topic, we all come to it with our own particular shade of rose-colored lenses. And we all don't always see everything the same. And this is what I will say to each of you as well, that as you explore these individuals and their writings and the interpretations of them as we are trying to do in the book, you will have your own sets of interpretations, but you're also, fortunately, you are a congregation that worship together. So that you have some better sense of how who's who and who's what. And I could see it that as you were all coming on, that there was some chatter and you could talk and joke with each other, etc., which is a wonderful thing. But for us as scholars, not all of us knew each other. And as we had to dive into the sensitive material, as we wrote it, as Doug said, in the midst of COVID, and then having to process it through the Black Lives Matter movement, with the killing of several individuals over the time period that we're working and writing on this book, it forced us to really take the time to work at vulnerability and be willing to hear and listen to each other. And to not assume that we understood what our collaborators and friends were saying. And I think we can now say our friends and brothers and sisters were saying. But it took us a while to get to that point that we could begin to speak openly and honestly. And I think that that was an important part for me, Don, many of the colleagues were Methodists, and they had all this great theology and traditions. I came out of a very different background. And so it took a minute for me to process and understand and to work through and to come to feel comfortable to be able to share my perspectives and traditions and what does that mean, and to have them respected along the way. So I think my participation has really enhanced my deeper understanding of the importance of the fact that evangelism and justice are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And I think it's also confirmed for me that we wrote this book not knowing that it would be for such a time as this. And again, the timing of this book, when it came out, last February? Last February, we had absolutely no idea that we would end up where we are in our nation today. And I think that this, if taken seriously, it will help us all of us to kind of ground ourselves in our faith and to help us understand what it is we need to do and how we need to do it and the way in which we do it. I think that's as important as what we do. That we have to love with real love and integrity as we speak for justice, as we reach out and love to care for others, etc. So, Don, I think that's what I would say.
Well, that's a great question, Don. And AG has become a brother, not just a colleague. And I would say that for the other members of the group. So the most wonderful outcome of this project has actually been a series of friendships, I would say. Asa Mahan, who I said was David Ingram's mentor, said that his famous phrase was that every person is of intrinsic worth. That was his, when I talk about what theology undergirds who you are, that was his. That every person is made by God of intrinsic worth. We all have intrinsic worth just because we've been created. And if we take that view seriously, that's I think what I took away from this project is, what does it mean to believe that God's love truly was shed for every single person by our Savior Jesus? What does it mean to think that every single person on the face of the earth has been created and loved? And then we get the opportunity to do the same. I mean, it's so simple, really, isn't it? I mean, the gospel is not difficult. It's very, very simple. Love God, love neighbor. it's living it out that's tough. But that's what the church should be. And that's what these folks had, is they had each other because they weren't doing it alone. They were doing it together in a community. And that's what you all have in your own congregation. That's what we need. We have to, and I think as times get tough, which they may, we have to have each other. This is what we need. We need one another to support each other. And I think about that again, the Underground Railroad and how these people were working together across divisions and they were working ecumenically. But they were doing it in order, they had a goal and they believed that God was supporting them and loving them and encouraging them. So that's how my own spiritual life has been encouraged by this.
Thank you. I hope that the spiritual lives of everybody who's participating will have some of those same growth places. I mean, yes, many of us know one another, been and members of the same church for a number of years, but we also have people that are brand new members and people that aren't even members yet. And you know, the getting to know one another around these sensitive issues. I really appreciate you sharing about how important and valuable that is, and also how it requires trust and faith and builds those deep friendship relationship, which is one of the things that we would hope will come out of this Awakening to Justice group as well. Is there anybody else who has any other questions for?
Dawn, I just wanted to share, I couldn't help but think as I watched Jimmy Carter's funeral today, and also a lot of the ink that's been spilled about his life recently. I know I sent you an email. Somewhere in his writing, he said what motivated the way he lived his life. He said, "My faith does not give me a choice, it gives me a mandate." And it was very interesting from a theological point of view that he is someone who really walked the walk. And it was ironic today to look at all the politicians and all the power people in their own silence, nodding their head in reverence, with a kind of passive recognition of what he stood for. Because I think he is, politics aside, just as an individual, he would be an ally of all the people we're talking about.
Absolutely.
I think it was a good national example. It was
Yeah,
humble.
absolutely. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I thought of that too today, Jim. And I encourage you, there was an article in today's New York Times that talks about the friendship between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. And I thought, wow, what an example of what we need. And it was in the article, it talks about how they had a shared faith that really helped to bind them, even though they disagreed on certain things. And I think that's important as well. Yeah.
I think a grassroots opportunity. In fact, many of the grassroots opportunities we have here in Canandaigua and through our church to demonstrate our faith and to work as a team to change situations is the opportunity that we need to take advantage of. My wife Maria is involved in the Call to Care group. What are they doing? They're bringing in refugees from Ukraine, from Venezuela, from any different country. These are all refugees that are official refugees, not a migrant of some sort, but getting them incorporated into the economy and culture of the United States. And it's hard to describe how much camaraderie there is among the leadership and the volunteers in that group to make this happen. And it's something that's just a great sight. And we have in our church many opportunities like that. The opportunity to work with Family Promise, where the main beneficiaries of Family Promise are homeless people. That couldn't be a better way to demonstrate your faith and to do it in partnership with a bunch of other people that agree with that goal and the community gets to see that action. We've started with the All Are Welcome project to get into diversity, equity, and inclusion. And right now that's a sensitive area. So we need to be able to demonstrate that we believe in that concept and it's meaningful from our faith background, just as perfectly Doug couldn't have put it any better, that all people are intrinsically equal, regardless of what color, shape, size, language. And we need to reinforce that universal concept. And so we may have an opportunity to do that going forward here. But things like Gleaner's Kitchens, we have volunteers that go over there every week to help serve food to people who are don't have food every day. So what better way to demonstrate our faith and our treatment of people less fortunate than we are? Now, we can find other opportunities, I'm sure, but those are just among several that are available right in our home church. So, but I'm a little biased since I'm the team captain of the social action team, but it's important. It's important. I think it's the right thing. You wonder sometimes, what can I do as an individual? Well, I'll tell you what you can do. We've got 18 different things you can do, and you'll be doing it with other people, and it'll be an example to the community and to the people that we're serving that people do care and they do love each other. So that's my commercial.
Are there any other last questions for Doug or AG?
I just put in the chat too. Some of you, I think you were wondering about the book, my dissertation that became a book through Syracuse University Press, which is available on Amazon if you're interested, on upstate New York abolition, much more detail about each community. And I would let you know about which towns around you had abolitionist churches.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
So if nobody else has any other questions, I would like to remind us that our next gathering date will be February 13th, and we will gather via Zoom. And we won't have these wonderful co-authors, collaborators with us, but we will be on our own with that wonderful study guide. You'll get an email with an indication of how much that you need to read for that session. And I would like to go back to that study guide, and this is actually for the closing prayer for the introduction, but I would like to close us with this prayer adapted from David Ingram's journal entry. January 28th, 1840. Let's pray. Oh God, it is good to rest in you and stand still and see your salvation. Oh, for more active faith in your love and mercy to your children. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you
Folks,
so
thank
much.
you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank
This
you.
was wonderful. It's good to see you, AG.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much,
Connie,
Doug.
get better, Connie.
Well, Brenda, it's so good to see you, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. This was quite powerful. Thank you.
And
Great.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Yes.
Mhm.
See you soon.
Okay.